al-Assad, we are going to meet with and talk to everyone. The reconciliation that we and Mr. de Mistura started is going to continue. It is the practical solution on the ground. You have to implement Security Council Resolution 2170 on al-Nusra and ISIS. Iran doesn't have any ambitions in Syria, and we would never allow any country influence our sovereignty. Israel supports armed terrorist groups in Syria. Good afternoon. His Excellency President Bashar al-Assad, in an interview with the American magazine Foreign Affairs, asserts that only by a political solution the war in Syria ends.
In an interview with the American magazine Foreign Affairs, President Bashar al-Assad asserted that the political solution is the certain ending of the war on Syria. The president said that all wars anywhere in the world have in the past ended with a political solution, because war itself is not the solution. Replying to a question on a perception that Syria has become divided into three statelets, one controlled by ISIS and another one by al-Nusra, the president rejected this image by saying, "This image is not accurate because you cannot talk about statelets without talking about the people who live within those statelets. The Syrian people are still with the unity of Syria. They still support the government. The factions you refer to control some areas, but they move from one place to another. They are not stable. But the main issue is about the population. The population still supports the state." On a question about the president's openness to a negotiated solution that leads to a political transition, the president asserted that the Syrian people should make the decision on any kind of political transition. The president expressed Syria's readiness to go to Russia in order to negotiate with a well-organized opposition that has an influence on the ground. President al-Assad said the opposition in general has to have representatives in the local administration, in the parliament, in institutions. In the current crisis, you have to ask about the opposition's influence on the ground. You have to go back to what the armed groups announced publicly when they said many times that the opposition doesn't represent us. They have no influence. If you want to talk about fruitful dialogue, it's going to be between the government and those armed groups. However, the president asserted that the government delegation will meet with everyone. On the proposal by UN Representative Staffan de Mistura for a freeze in Aleppo, the president said, "We implemented that before de Mistura was assigned to his mission. We implemented it in another city called Homs. We implemented it on smaller scales and it succeeded. So the idea is very good, but it depends on the details." De Mistura came to Syria with headlines. We agreed upon certain headlines, and now we're waiting for him to bring a detailed plan or schedule. We are discussing this with his deputy. Regarding the Moscow meeting with different parties of the so-called opposition, the president said that it is only preparations for a conference, pointing out that some figures are puppets of other countries. Some don't represent anyone in Syria. Some of them never lived in Syria, and they know nothing about the country. Of course, you have some other personalities who work for the national interests. So when you talk about the opposition as one entity, who's going to have influence on the other? That is the question. It's not clear yet. On the intention of the Americans to support the Moscow talks, the president said there is mistrust between the Syrians and the US. On the ground, the president said that there are now two different kinds of armed men in Syria. The majority are Al-Qaeda, which is ISIS and al-Nusra, with other similar factions that belong to Al-Qaeda, but are smaller. Now, what's left? What Obama called a fantasy, the moderate opposition. It is not an opposition. Most of them joined Al-Qaeda, and some of them rejoined the army recently. During the last week, a lot of them left those groups and came to the army. President al-Assad underlined that the reconciliation that we started and Mr. de Mistura is going to continue is the practical solution on the ground. He also called for implementing Security Council Resolution number 2170, and this resolution is very clear about preventing anyone from supporting these factions militarily, financially, or logistically. Yet, This is what Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar are still doing. As a step towards a solution in Syria, the president elaborated about the reconciliation process when people gave up their arms for amnesty and they returned to live normal lives. So reconciliation is a real example of confidence building, while the so-called opposition has no influence on the ground. The president talked about the role of Iran in the region as an influential country, even before the crisis, saying that Iran doesn't have any ambitions in Syria, and as a country, as Syria, we would never allow any country to have influence on our sovereignty. Answering a question about militias fighting along the Syrian government, President Assad said it is natural to say that only the institutions of the government are the guarantee for the stability and order. Any other factor that would play a role in parallel with the government could be positive, could be good in certain circumstances, but it will always have side effects. Regarding the recent Israeli attack in al-Qunaytra, President Assad said for Israel to allege that there was a plan for an operation is just an excuse, because what they wanted was to assassinate somebody from Hezbollah. President al-Assad said Israel has been attacking Syria for nearly 2 years without any reason, asserting that it is supporting the armed groups in Syria. Assad noted that whenever the Syrian army makes advances in some places, Israel attacks in order to undermine the army. President al-Assad said since the start of the crisis in Syria, 3 main decisions were taken by the leadership. First, to be open to dialogue. Second, the constitution changed. Third, was the decision to defend our country and fight terrorists. The president stressed that those who made mistakes regarding the way protesters were treated in a way that breached the law in the beginning of the unrest were detained. President al-Assad said the potential is always possible for cooperation with the United States because Syria has been talking about international cooperation against terrorism for 30 years, but this potential needs will. The question that we have is how much will does the United States have to really fight terrorism on the ground? President al-Assad explained by saying that so far we haven't seen anything genuine despite the attacks on ISIS in northern Syria, adding that since the beginning of the US-led attacks, ISIS has gained more ground in Syria and Iraq. The president said this means that they are not serious about fighting terrorism. President Assad made it clear that fighting terrorism does not only mean military involvement. He said if the terrorists can withstand the airstrikes for this period, it means that the Turks keep sending them armaments and money, referring that the United States did not put any pressure on Turkey to stop the support to al-Qaeda. Answering a question about what is required from the United States with regards to fighting terrorism, President Assad said pressure should be exerted on Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar to stop supporting armed groups. President Assad said legal cooperation is also required. He underlined that the fact that the United States did not ask for the Syrian government's permission for starting attacks in Syria makes that illegal. President Assad asserted that Syria is willing to cooperate with any country that is serious in fighting terrorism, stressing that any troops that don't work in cooperation with the Syrian army are illegal and should be fought. The president said that during the war, the Syrian people rejected terrorists and showed increasing support to the Syrian government and army. President al-Assad pointed out that Erdogan is personally responsible for supporting terrorism in Syria because he embraces the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the main ideology of al-Qaeda.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said that Moscow's talks on the crisis in Syria aims at offering a space for discussions, pointing out that all sides taking part in the talks agree on the necessity of realizing peace and combating terrorism in Syria. Sources at the Russian Foreign Ministry said that Lavrov might take part in Moscow's consultative meeting. Noteworthy is that representatives of the Syrian opposition have kicked off their talks in Moscow. Sources have indicated that Russia has turned these meetings as a forum because they function as consultative meetings, which would pave the way for a dialogue to be held later in Moscow or in Damascus, as would be agreed upon by the Syrian government's delegation and that of the opposition. The rockets and mortars fired by terrorists on various residential neighborhoods in the city of Damascus yesterday left 3 civilians martyred, with the army responding by striking the sources of the attacks. More than 30 civilians have been injured, some of them in critical condition. by the attacks that took place in the areas of Al-Shahbandar Square, Mazza, Al-Abed Street, Al-Midan, Al-Fahama, Al-Rawda, Baghdad Street, Al-Abbasin area, Ruknuddin, opposite to the Minister of Higher Education, and near Al-Fayha Sports Complex. More mortars and rockets hit the area of Mazza 86 around Damascus University's dormitory and Kafir Souseh, causing material damage according to the police command. The command said that one woman was martyred after being hit with the shrapnel from a shell. She was rushed to the French hospital, but she passed away. Another woman was martyred and 3 were injured when a shell hit a house in Ash al-Warwar neighborhood, while a source at Al-Muwassat hospital said that 12 people were injured. 1 of them passed away. 18 more injured civilians arrived in Damascus hospital, while 6 others were admitted to the Red Crescent hospital. Syrian Arab army units have killed many terrorists and injured others in Ma'raba, Atman, and Al-Haraq in the Daraa countryside. Other army units, in cooperation with the locals, have fought attacks by terrorists against a military checkpoint in Al-Sahliya farms along Daraa's old road, killing and injuring many of them. Army units have targeted terrorist gatherings in Busra, Tafas, Khirbat Ghazala, and Al-Lajat, killing tens of them. In Iraq, the army supported by the popular forces freed Diala City from ISIS terrorists, as Iraqi army units eliminated one of the most famous ISIS leaders northeast of Baquba and destroyed an ISIS camp north of Tikrit, killing 5 terrorists in Al-Anbar governorate. With this, we conclude our news for today. Thank you for watching. For more details about Syria and the region and to view this bulletin again, you can always visit our website in English, syriaonline.sy. Now to latest business and market news with Serena, but after a short break.